millions of people saw at Sullivan's Mill on Sunday nights. Something happened in 1955 though, and he snapped. Witnesses were shocked when Sullivan exploded with statements so outrageous that they couldn't believe it. It all started when a young musician modified one tune. His otherwise impeccable reputation was shattered when he uttered a racial slur. It was on the verge of being physical. Workers were compelled to separate them. Nobody mentioned it for many years. A lifelong ban was imposed on the musician. Rock and roll as we knew it will never be the same after what he did that night on live TV. Ed Sullivan was born in Harlem, New York on September 28, 1901 as a set of identical twins. Daniel, who was born prematurely, was ill and didn't make it more than a few months. Being the sole surviving twin cast a shadow over Ed's youth. And he carried the burden of his loss with him. An emptiness, a subtle melancholy molded him even as a little lad. Peter and Elizabeth, his parents, were large Irish families. Out of 8 children, Ed was the third to make it through infancy. There was a plethora of life and sorrow in that house. Another tragedy struck while Ed was only 5 years old. Another devastating loss for the family came with his baby sister's passing. The agony was too much for Elizabeth to bear. After much deliberation, she chose to uproot their lives from Harlem and settle in the northern town of Portchester. There was less chaos and more serenity in Portchester. The loss never ever left Ed, despite his parents' hopes that the transition would bring them healing. Ed learned to deal with sadness even when he was a little lad. Ed overcame all of this and became known as the miracle child. He grew up listening to music from all around the world because he was born into a neighborhood where Jewish and Irish families lived side by side. Ed soaked it all in as cars gradually supplanted horse-drawn carriages. He was one of 8 kids, but he was the only one to make it through childhood. The precariousness of existence was a constant reminder. His mom and dad embraced him tightly. He was a miracle for them. Sadness was always there in the house, but the music helped. The Sullivan family filled the rooms with their harmonious singing as they gathered around the piano. They dealt with it through music. Ed would never be able to break the habit. Years later, as a well-known TV host, he would reflect on those formative years and the power of music to alleviate hardship. Additionally, Ed's demand for control manifested itself as he matured. For his high school team, he was the MVP. He received 12 letters in athletics between 1916 and 1919. He played the position of halfback with great tenacity in football. The basketball court is occupied by a swift defender, a sprinter who is quick on his feet. However, in his roles as catcher and captain for the baseball team, he excelled. He was formative in these. His self-control and leadership abilities were shaped by them, and he was a natural leader. Ed led the baseball team as captain, instructing his players on proper positioning and game strategy. His reputation and championships both skyrocketed after that. The confidence he gained in that position will serve him well later in his career. As the United States entered World War I at the age of 17, Ed fled to Chicago in an attempt to serve in the Navy. However, they returned him home since he was too young and without proper documentation. He showed audacity in that unfruitful endeavor. It took him in a new direction as well. Ed had also found writing at that point. He was the sports columnist and editor for the school newspaper while he was a student. His first job after finishing college was with the Portchester Daily Item. Ed was thrilled to receive $1.00 for each piece, and he devoured them all. He would go on to work for the Hartford Post, the Evening Mail, the Associated Press, and finally the Evening Graphic in New York City. This was the beginning of his career as a journalist. His lifelong interest in writing and athletics set him up for success on a far grander scale. Ed learned about fairness through sports as well. As a kid, he didn't give much thought to the fact that he played sport with black athletes. To him, it was second nature. He never considered it weird to meet teams in Connecticut that had black players when he went there for games. He carried that attitude of equality with him. Eventually, when Ed Sullivan hosted his own TV show, he would provide black performers a stage when no one else would. In 1919, Ed Sullivan considered transferring to the Hartford Post as a significant advancement in his career. He was looking for fresh prospects after leaving the Portchester Daily Item and joining a larger newspaper. However, that strategy quickly collapsed. He was already out of a job before he had even had a chance to settle in, since the Hartford Post went bankrupt in his first week on the job. It was an unexpected and unfortunate setback, particularly because the newspaper industry was booming during that period. Newspapers usually don't close after a few days. Upon discovering how unstable the newspaper industry could be, Sullivan had to start looking for jobs from the beginning again. Nonetheless, he continued unabated. He was much more resolute to keep on after that. Early on, the lesson, however brief and unpleasant, molded his desire and perseverance. After his time at the Hartford Post came to an end, Sullivan picked himself up and took a job reporting sports for the New York Evening Mail. Even that publication went out of business in 1923. He went through a hard patch. After this, failing at newspaper after newspaper, he took a job at the Morning World, the Associated Press, the New York Bulletin, the Morning Telegraph, and the Leader. Between 1923 and 1927, he was always on the hunt for a new job. As soon as one of his publications went under, you would think most individuals would have given up after such a challenging cycle. No, Sullivan was not going to give up. Taking on new jobs allowed him to hone his abilities and expand his professional network. It revealed his genuine enthusiasm for journalism, despite the fact that it was difficult and uncertain. Particularly formative were the years spent working for the Associated Press. When it came to news organizations, the AP was up there with the best of them. Working with the Associated Press allowed Sullivan to get more important assignments and national stories, but his continued freelancing with other journals such as the Morning Telegraph and the Philadelphia Bulletin. During this time, which ended in 1927, Sullivan gained experience in covering a wide range of topics, including sports and breaking events. His image as someone who could adapt and create powerful stories was solidified even as he was in the midst of frequent job changes. When he left the AP, he had established himself as a competent journalist. In the same year, Sullivan made a significant move. He began his career as a sports writer for the New York Evening Graphic in 1927. It was known for its daring and frequently scandalous stories, and the graphic was very ostentatious. Sullivan flourished and rose rapidly through the ranks. He quickly rose to the position of sports editor, marking his first permanent leadership position. Another notable encounter he had at the Graphic was with Walter Winchell, a renowned gossip journalist of that day. Following Winchell's 1929 departure for the Daily Mirror, Sullivan assumed the role of Broadway columnist for the Graphic. he gained fresh influence and exposure to the entertainment industry through that piece. People knew Sullivan's name by the time the business folded in 1932. He joined the New York Daily News in 1932 as a columnist covering Broadway. Little Old New York, his now famous column, first appeared around that time. Until 1974, readers checked it daily for 42 years. Sullivan chronicled the highs and lows of the city's most famous performers, Broadway musicals, and private lives. Because it was honest, crisp, and immersed in the drama at all times, his voice was beloved by many. Some people could become famous overnight just because Sullivan mentioned them. Readers outside of New York could also follow the drama because his piece was syndicated. Sullivan continued to adjust to the ever-changing entertainment industry year after year. That's the secret to his continued success. Being a talent scout was another one of Sullivan's many activities. There was more to Little Old New York than idle chatter. It was the platform where up-and-coming performers and actors could shine. Before everyone else, Sullivan could spot talent. The power of a single encouraging comment in his column is immense. Conversely, a careless comment could damage someone's reputation if he disliked them. The fate of their program could be determined by a single line in his column, so actors and producers would read it first thing in the morning. The news wasn't all Sullivan was doing, he was handcrafting it. You might spot him at all the major events, such as theater openings and parties outside the newspaper offices. No matter what happens, Sullivan was always present. However, New York's nightlife also served as a battlefield in and of itself. The world-renowned Morocco Club became Sullivan's new home that served as his de facto base of operations. Walter Winchell, his adversary, was at the Stork Club across town. In these glamorous spots where politicians and Hollywood stars spent their nights, the two men battled for attention. The competition included every notable face that entered the building. The select clientele and stringent admission policy of Winchell's Stork Club made it famous. The glitz and power of Sullivan's El Morocco made it famous. Everyone in New York City knew how competitive these two colonists were. Between them, they controlled the city's nightlife. It quickly rose to prominence as a citywide conversation starter. Showing up at any club might have a significant impact on one's reputation. Writing wasn't enough for Sullivan. He also resolved to dominate radio, just like Winchell. The Ed Sullivan Show debuted on CBS in 1932, marking his radio debut. Jack Benny and George M. Coe were among the famous guests, and new listeners he gained from that show. Sullivan continued presenting shows until 1946, when he hosted Ed Sullivan's Pipelines. His 1941 show was Ed Sullivan Variety, and his 1944 show was Ed Sullivan Entertains. More and more people heard his name with each episode. For him, radio was ideal. It allowed him to reach more people and disseminate celebrity rumors more quickly. As a familiar voice, people started to put their faith in him. His abilities in radio demonstrated that he could multitask. In 1948, CBS made a bold move. A new variety show called Toast of the Town premiered on Sunday nights, and Ed Sullivan was appointed to host it. Sullivan had never written for television before. He was a newspaper writer. Marlo Lewis, a producer at CBS, had faith in Sullivan's straightforward delivery. Sullivan doubted. The things they say they will do, I have already taken care of. His tone was lighthearted. On June 20, 1948, the show debuted with a meager budget of $1.00, 1775. Not even Jerry Lewis or Dean Martin were paid more than $200.00 to make an appearance. Patrons were frightened. His colleagues were concerned that he lacked glitz, but William Paley, head of CBS, had faith in him. Sullivan battled for top guests and helped build the show into a 20-year hit. That achievement was not achieved without suffering. Everyone despised him. Their opinion of his ungainly delivery was negative. His lack of character was detailed by Harriet Van Horn. Some of his detractors also characterized him as awkward, stiff, and hopeless. It hit close to home for Sullivan. He went so far as to pen a brief, scathing letter to Van Horn once. However, at home, individuals continued to observe. Sullivan did nothing, even according to Alan King's jokes, although no one did a better job of it. Over time, Sullivan adapted to it. Funny people were able to play him off of him. He gained more admirers as a result. His ability to make fun of himself was a hit with his audiences. Viewers persisted despite sneers from critics. An integral aspect of the show's character was Sullivan's eccentric flair. He seems anxious on camera. His posture was perpetually slouched. He spoke in a nasal tone. They suspected he suffered from Bell's palsy. The way he sucked on a lemon was likened as a smile in Time magazine. However, he was perfectly healthy. He received many letters from admirers who lauded his bravery. He had wooden movements that comedians imitated. Because of that, he became well known. This was an image that Sullivan never resisted. He happily welcomed it, in fact. His genuine charisma and hilarious antics propelled him to stardom. The program had relocated by 1953. 1697 Broadway is home to CBS Studio 50. The theater had been constructed in 1927. The interior was magnificent, with stained glass and a Gothic ceiling. Fitting cameras and gear inside was a challenge. To ensure interference-free operation, even the adjacent subway had to be protected. The theater was very special to Sullivan. To commemorate its 20th anniversary on broadcast, CBS rechristened it the Ed Sullivan Theater in 1967. A TV star rarely received such a distinction. Even now that theater stands, Stephen Colbert and David Letterman would later make it their home. A lot of famous people played there, but Sullivan is the main reason most people remember it. Initially, the program was still referred to as Toast of the Town. This, in Sullivan's opinion, did not give him sufficient credit. People saw it as his show before anyone else. It was rechristened The Ed Sullivan Show by CBS on September 21st, 1955. To Sullivan, that was important. He was solidified as one of the most influential guys in television. He would have Elvis Presley perform a year after that. With 60 million viewers, Elvis was a huge hit. Back then, it set a new standard for television. Sullivan was immortalized by the combination of his new moniker and a massive crowd. However, Sullivan was not always cooperative. It was backstage on November 20, 1955, that Bo Diddley he sang Tennessee Ernie Ford smash hit 16 Tons, which Sullivan overheard. Within 3 weeks, that song had sold over 1 million copies. Diddley was instructed by Sullivan to play it, probably hoping it would boost his career. Diddley consented. The cue card stated Bo Diddley 16 tons, so he assumed he was supposed to do both. He went with his own tune, Bo Diddley, instead when he was on the air. One of the most defiant episodes of early television was born out of that decision. An R&B portion featured Diddley. The audience went absolutely bonkers as he performed his own tune. Anger consumed Sullivan. Diddley's infectious zeal and signature rhythm were unforgettable. The contagious Bo Diddley beat was initially heard by many Americans. It just took 2 minutes, but it altered the course of rock and roll irrevocably. Sullivan was furious when the cameras cut out. He turned his ire on Diddley. The accounts of Diddley and other witnesses indicate that Sullivan went so far as to accuse him of being the first black lad to ever betray him. That racial comment was very disgusting, although Sullivan had previously advocated for black artists. His bigotry and irritability were on display here. The altercation was intense. People on staff had to physically restrain them. An altercation was on the verge of breaking out. Diddley felt the need to strike Sullivan. The management of Diddley attempted to reassure him, according to the management. That's Ed Sullivan. Diddley was indifferent. He was told by Sullivan that he would never work in television again. Sullivan abruptly ended your 6 months of service. Diddley could not come back. Millions of people enjoyed watching Ed Sullivan on television. However, Betty, his daughter, has stated an entirely different account. She mentioned that her father was known to have an explosive temper that might be triggered by trivial matters. While Ed was in the company of others, he had an air of effortless charisma. When he was alone, he could lash out at anyone. In one instance, Betty recounted, Ed became quite angry and slammed doors after a minor argument at home. His relatives quickly learned to be cautious around him. They had no idea what could trigger his anger. On film, he rarely displayed this anger. It remained concealed beneath the well-known courteous grin. At home, though, it felt extremely genuine. This unexpected aspect of him was something his loved ones had to deal with daily. When the cameras were not rolling, Ed was quite different from his public demeanor, according to Betty. Because of his performance, many assumed he was sociable and extroverted. The truth was that he was really an introvert. He enjoyed being by himself. Instead of celebrating or mingling with visitors after a broadcast, he frequently retreated to his dressing area. He was able to lose himself in a newspaper or TV show for hours, even when he was at home. This wasn't just a passing emotion. Being that way came easily to him. The stark difference between his outward persona as a gregarious host and his inner life as a reclusive loner was so great that even his co-workers occasionally mistook his apparent coldness for a lack of warmth. At the height of the Cold War, his concerns had a darker underside as well. Ed was led to believe her partner was a communist sympathizer, according to one story Betty told. It occurred during the height of the Cold War in the late 1950s or early 1960s, when widespread communist terror gripped the United States. On the subject of the boy's history, Ed interrogated Betty. He contemplated expelling him from the premises. His fear that his daughter was involved with a radical group led him to seek the counsel of others. There was absolutely no evidence to support this baseless suspicion. The era's pervasive fear affected even Ed Sullivan, a vocal civil rights advocate who openly invited African-American singers to his show. When it came to his feelings, Ed was similarly someone who kept his distance. After learning that Ed seldom expressed his sentiments or exhibited affection, his grandson Rob was ready. Rob thought Ed put on this emotional facade to numb his suffering. Two of Ed's siblings, a sister and a twin brother, died at an early age. He was cautious about expressing his emotions after these setbacks. He maintained his expressionless countenance even after graduating from college. Cooter resisted the urge to act. What made Ed appear distant to outsiders and even certain members of his own family, according to Rob, was this very thing. He seemed unfeeling on the outside, but there was a man behind that tough veneer. His attitude and his handling of the strains of fame were influenced by it. The same conflict between his public persona and his private actions manifested itself in his interactions with performers as well. His show was scheduled to air the doors live on September 17, 1967. The producers informed them that they needed to alter a line in Light My Fire before they took the stage. They felt it implied drug use, so they wanted the word higher removed. During rehearsal, the band members communicated with the producers by nodding and agreeing. However, Jim Morrison informed the others they wouldn't be making any changes the moment they stepped out of the room. Even though they were anxious, the other members of the band supported him. I believe they were joking, guitarist Robbie Krieger remarked afterwards. "Fuck it!" I yelled out. "Let's proceed in the same manner as before." They resolved not to surrender. Earlier that evening, the show went live. As always, Ed introduced them with grace. After playing a short song, they began to play Light My Fire. Film was shot, all eyes were on the screen. Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher was Morrison's song that she sang only when it mattered. Everyone in the audience just went wild. A completely different atmosphere pervaded backstage. Furious were the producers. The show's producer, Ed Sullivan, dropped by their dressing room after the performance. The relatives and viewers of the broadcast stated he became enraged and swore at them, accusing them of betraying the confidence of the audience and the network. The band was informed that all future performances would not go forward. Unmoved, the doors remained. Jim Morrison famously responded when someone informed them they would never perform on the show again. "We just did," he said, with a composed shrug and a hint of a smile. The essence of the group was captured in that single statement. Their desires had been fulfilled. One of the most prominent American venues had featured them, while remaining loyal to who they were. That event is still referenced in interviews, documentaries, and films, even after all these years have passed. The Rolling Stones made an appearance on Ed Sullivan's show on January 15, 1967. Listen to their new song, Let's Spend the Night Together, as they were about to perform. The creators of the show and CBS felt the title was inappropriate for a family-friendly television program. Either they wanted the band to stop or they wanted them to change the lyrics. The Stones relented when pushed. They sang instead, "How about we spend some time hanging out?" At that moment, it was quite significant. The original lyrics were considered too defiant by American television, which was notoriously rigid at the time, although they were in agreement. The Stones were not pleased. It was a well-known incident. It depicted the struggle between rock music and the censorship of television. It was further evidence of the influence that television has over creative types. Then the radio stations did the same. When playing the song, many of them either muted the word night or just didn't play it. The song's rating in the US dropped because of that. However, the United Kingdom was unconcerned. The song was uncensored. However, the Stones' image of defiance was present even at that time. They were already well known for being trailblazers. Their already stellar reputation took a major hit after their divisive lip-sync performance at Sunday night's London Palladium. Everyone remembers the Ed Sullivan incident as a watershed point in the rock industry's infamous censorship struggle. Mick Jagger chose to make a statement throughout the performance. While performing Let's Spend Some Time Together, he couldn't help but roll his eyes whenever the camera was rolling. People took note of the seemingly insignificant change. There was no mistaking the sarcasm in the eye rolls. He was implying that they were unhappy with the shift in this way. Producers and audience alike noticed it. The eye roll gained notoriety as a subtle way to express disapproval. The Rolling Stones had consented to alter the lyrics, in contrast to Jim Morrison of The Doors, who adamantly objected and was thus banned. However, they maintained their determination. They could play by the rules while yet making fun of them, as Mick's eye rolls demonstrate. A lot of people assumed this was premeditated. Many others assumed that Mick was simply being himself. In any case, I will never forget it. People still use those few seconds to illustrate how a band may be rebellious without actually breaching the laws. This was followed a few years later by yet another well-known altercation with Ed Sullivan. Comedian Jackie Mason made an appearance in October 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson interrupted Mason midway through his speech to make an immediate announcement. Upon the show's return, Sullivan informed Mason that he had 2 minutes remaining by holding up 2 fingers off screen. As a joke, Mason started mentioning fingers. He continuously gestured toward individuals, offering them one finger after another. Mason was making what Sullivan took to be an obscenity-inducing motion toward him. It appeared to Sullivan that Mason was using his thumb as a middle finger. Anger consumed Sullivan. Mason had a contract for 6 appearances, but he cancelled them after the program. The $45,000 0-cents deal was worth more than $450,000 0-cents when converted to today's money. The unpredictability and illness of Mason were described by Sullivan to the press. Mason insisted he had never snubbed Sullivan, but no one took him seriously. Mason was unsuccessful in his libel suit against Sullivan. The news outlets all ran with the tale. Mason's professional standing plummeted. Strong was Sullivan. Fights with him resulted in job loss. For the most part, Mason couldn't watch TV. His recovery took nearly 2 decades. It didn't help when Sullivan apologized and reinstated Mason to the show. The harm had already been done. He was known as the comedian who made a fool of himself on national television. He was considered too dangerous to book by the producers. Mason was compelled to perform minor club and bit roles. He didn't get his career back on track until much later. Everyone was still thinking about the finger incident, even at that late hour. Learning not to cross Sullivan was a tough lesson. As a host, Sullivan had more to offer. He guarded entryways. Doing what he says could ruin a career. Who could be on Sullivan's show? Sullivan was quite picky about it. He was the one who many painters had to copy. Filming has to be done from the waist up, even for famous people like Elvis Presley. It was Sullivan who would often rule on matters of propriety. Still, people were surprised to see another side to him. Despite his authoritarian tendencies, he was able to hire more black performers than his contemporaries. Sullivan began providing African-American performers with a national platform in 1948. Racism and segregation were prevalent during this time. A few sponsors advised him not to book them anymore. An executive from Ford once advised him to cease. He was expelled from the theater by Sullivan. Sullivan emphasized that talent was more important than prejudice. Many famous musicians graced his show, including James Brown, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Sammy Davis Jr., The Supremes, and The Temptations. Civil rights icons such as Coretta Scott King also made an appearance. Sullivan was daring. That was one reason why he was so beloved. He was seen by some as being deceitful. Performers who dared to cross him, like as Bo Diddley, were known to be blacklisted. by him behind the scenes. Still, he did more than others to promote black actors and actresses on screen. Through it all, Sullivan maintained his show's air times from June 29, 1948 to June 6, 1971. It was broadcast on CBS. 1,000 episodes is that. Millions of Americans watched it every Sunday. Anyone from Elvis Presley to the Beatles was introduced to them by Sullivan. Richard Pryor and Carol Burnett, among others, were comedy stars who also appeared. Roughly 73 million people tuned in to see the Beatles perform on February 9, 1964. For his day, that was unprecedented. Strict control was Sullivan's claim to fame. The only part of Elvis that was exposed was his waist. Lyrics were altered by the Rolling Stones, but appearing on Sullivan may be a career-defining event. There was a sense of euphoria upon the show's 1971 cancellation by CBS. Not long after that, Sullivan passed away. March 16, 1973 was the date of his wife Sylvia's death. Their encounter in 1926 led to their marriage on April 28, 1930. Since she was Jewish and he was Catholic, they initially kept their connection a secret. Solomon was actually identified as Ed Solomon, according to her family. At last, in 1930, they secretly slipped away at City Hall. Elizabeth was born to them 8 months later. Teamwork was key for the Sullivans. Sylvia was very candid in her post-show critiques of Ed. He was devastated when she passed away in 1973. Sullivan received his own diagnosis of esophageal cancer 1 year down the road. His loved ones chose not to give him the whole story. They were afraid it would cause him undue distress. Sullivan disappeared within a few weeks. This man passed away at the age of 73 on October 13, 1974. St. Patrick's Cathedral was the site of his funeral. Paul McCartney subsequently recalled seeing Sullivan and believing he had forgotten his identity. Much had changed about Sullivan by that point. Years later, Rob, Sullivan's grandson, and Betty, his daughter, discussed Sullivan's domineering personality. Bob Precht, the show's producer, was married to Betty in 1952. She had witnessed firsthand how Ed took care of every little thing. As a perfectionist, Sullivan gained fame